שלום לכולם, צהריים טובים, ערב טוב. אני איין, אנחנו פה במרכז איין ראנד, קוראים את הספר The Ominous Parallels, זה ספר מאת לאונרד פיקוף, הממשיך האינטלקטואלי של איין ראנד. הוא סוקר את האידיאולוגיה הנאצית ומדגים כיצד הרעיונות היסודיים והמהותיים מבחינה פילוסופית באידיאולוגיה הזאת. סליחה על זה. זהו. הספר מציג כיצד היסודות הפילוסופיים של האידיאולוגיה הנאצית למעשה עדיין קיימים היום אצלנו במערב. אנחנו הגענו במפגש האחרון, עצרנו בתחילת פרק 12, היטלר פאוור, ולפני שנתחיל שאלות, טענות, מענות. יופי, בועז בבקשה.
Chapter 12, Hitler in Power. It took over a century for the ideas of the Kantian axis to be implanted in the German mind. It took 14 years for Hitler, relying on this preparation, to rise to the position of chancellor. It took 6 months for the new chancellor to transform the country into a totalitarian state. The process of transformation consisted in establishing the nation's collectivist premise fully as the undisputed, uncontradicted law of the land. The method was to wipe out any limitation on the power of the central government. The first major step was the decree for the protection of the people and the state, promulgated by the aged Hindenburg on February 28, 1933. This decree abrogated individual rights in Germany.
אוקיי, בואו נעצור רגע. אני חושב שההתחלה של הפרק הזה מאוד מאוד חזקה, וזה מתחבר לעמדה של הפילוסופיה הקולקטיביסטית על הכוח של רעיונות. והפרק הזה מתחיל בכך, זה לקח 100 שנה, יותר מ-100, בשביל הרעיונות של הציר הקיינטיאני, להיות בעצם מוטמעים בתוך המוח הגרמני. האדם, הם חלחלו להיות שבורים במוחו של כמעט כל אדם בגרמניה בצורה כזו או אחרת. ככה זה מעל 100 שנה. לקח להיטלר, שנשען על התהליך הזה בין 100 שנה, לקח לו 14 שנים להגיע לעמדת הקאנצלר. ומעמדת הקאנצלר לקח לו חצי שנה להפוך את גרמניה למדינה טוטליטרית, אוקיי? זה מאוד מאוד חשוב. אפשר להסתכל על זה שלקח לו 14 שנה להגיע לעמדת כוח, או לקח לו חצי שנה להפוך בעמדת הכוח הזאת לגרמניה למדינה טוטליטרית, אך הדבר החשוב פה הוא over a century של הרעיונות של קאנט שהם חלחלו, זה הדבר המהותי כאן, ועל זה הוא נשען. ובלי זה זה לא היה קורה. ואם פילוסופיה אחרת הייתה שולטת במוח הגרמני, למשל פילוסופיה נאורה יותר במובן של הרעיונות שהביאו למשל להקמת ארצות הברית, אז היטלר זה לא היה אפשרי בשבילו לעלות לשלטון ולעשות את כל מה שהיה אחר. ועכשיו אנחנו בעצם נכנסים לתהליך, וכאמור הצעד הראשון הוא החוק להגנת העם והמדינה, שאותו חתם עליו הינדנבורג ב-28 בפברואר 1933, החוק abrogated individual rights in Germany. כי הוא הנשיא.
סתם לחייב.
הנשיא, היטלר העביר את החוק, הנשיא חתם עליו, הוא יכול היה לעשות משבר חוקתי, אז הוא בחר שלא לעשות. בועז.
Restrictions on personal liberty, the decree stated, on the right of free expression of opinion, including freedom of the press, on the rights of assembly and association, and violations of the privacy of postal, telegraphic, and telephonic communications, and warrants for house searchers, orders for confiscations, as well as restrictions on property, are also permissible beyond the legal limits otherwise prescribed. A month later, the power of the Reichstag was formally annulled. The Enabling Act of March 23 transferred to Hitler all legislative prerogatives including the right to deviate from the Constitution at his sole discretion.
כן, אני רוצה רגע. פה זה כבר, מי שלמד היסטוריה במערכת החינוך הישראלית כבר מכיר את הצעדים האלה, את המונחים, זה חוק ההסמכה. כן, בבקשה.
This act was approved by the Republic's last freely elected Reichstag. That body committed suicide by a vote of 444 to 94. The Social Democrats cast the negative votes. The Communists had been barred from their seats. All the other parties voted yes. The non-Nazi parties, including the Nationalists, were then dissolved. The individual states were turned into mere administrative arms of the Reich. The courts leaped to apply the new rule that the law and the will of the Führer are one. The officer corps, still a powerful force in Germany, approved Hitler's policy of rearmament and voiced no opposition to the process of Nazification.
שימו לב, יש פה ממש כל זרועות המדינה, למעשה קיבלו את התהליך הזה בהכנעה, ויש פה, שוב, יש פה עניין רעיוני. משהו הפך אותנו לפריחים, למוכנים לקבל את העיקרון שהחוק והפועל הם אחד. עכשיו, אתם יודעים, זה העניין של מצד אחד חברה נאורה, תזכרו את הפרק שקראנו על ארצות הברית ועל החוקה שלה, זה שלטון החוק, לעומת ההסתכלות האפלטונית, האינטיאנית, ההגליאנית של המנהיג שמביא לביטוי את רצון הקולקטיב, הוא הסמכות העליונה. כן.
If anyone did voice opposition, he found two new institutions to deal with, both copied from Soviet Russia, the Gestapo and the concentration camps. Special government bodies were created to control, according to the requirements of the public interest, every aspect of literature, music, the fine arts, the theater, the movies, radio, and the press. Hundreds of tons of books were destroyed. The Marxists and the cultural modernists and several other groups had done their job. Hitler had no further need for anarchy and subversion of the system. The churches were not regarded as subversive. Though harassed and intimidated, they were allowed to function.
אוקיי, יש בפסקה הזאת הרבה. אוקיי, אז בואו נפרק אותה רגע, כי זו פסקה חשובה. קודם כל, אוקיי, הוקמו גופים ממשלתיים חשובים כדי לשלוט בציבור באופן שיביא לידי מציאות ויהלום את האינטרס הציבורי. וזה כמובן שם קוד לכוח טוטליטרי לעשות כל דבר שרירותי שאני רוצה, מאיזה סיבה שאני רוצה. יבוא הפיורר ויגיד, אני מבטיח חירויות, אני שולח אנשים אצל הסובייטים זה לגולאג, אצל הנאצים זה ה-concentration camps, אני שולח את הגשטאפו שיעלימו את הבן אדם הזה וזה, כי זה משרת את האינטרס הציבורי. שימו לב שבכל העולם שהוא היום כלכלות מעורבות, זאת אומרת המערב, המדינות היחסית חופשיות, גם שם, כאשר המדינה רוצה לעשות משהו שרירותי, להפקיע רכוש, להטיל מגבלה וכולי, הנימוק הוא אותו נימוק, כמו של הנאצים, הנימוק הוא האינטרס הציבורי, אוקיי? אז שם זה, אצלנו זה פקידות או הכרעת רוב או whatever, אז פה זה הפיורר, יש איזשהו גורם שהוא בא לממש את האינטרס הציבורי. אז האינטרס הציבורי זה מילת קסם, להצדיק בעצם כל דבר שרירותי שמישהו במשטר רוצה לעשות, מכל צד שם. והם עשו את זה כמובן כדי לצנזר, כדי להשתמש בגשטאפו ובגולאגים. זה אחד. שתיים, מציינים פה דבר קונקרטי שקרה, והוא מעיד על תופעה שהיא קיימת במשטרים טוטליטריים ורודנויות. השלב שלפני הרודנות, השלב של חוסר היציבות, הוא מצב שבו יש כל מיני גופים שהם מתנגדים לסדר הישן, מתנגדים לסדר שבו לאנשים יש חירות ויש להם זכויות וכולי, וכמובן הם נתגעו את זה בצורה מוריפה. אז ברפובליקת ויימאר היה את הנאצים והיה את הקומוניסטים והיה את השמרנים הפרוסים, המלוכנים, והיה את השמאל המודרניסטי, וכל החבורה הניהליסטים האלה, והם כולם לחמו קצת אחד בשני, אבל גם כתף אל כתף, להביס את הסדר הישן. מרגע שהיטלר השיג את המטרה שלו, אז מבחינתו הקומוניסטים והמודרניסטים והמלוכנים, הם סיימו את התפקיד שלהם, הם כבר לא עוזרים לו, הם נטל מבחינתו, ועכשיו זה הזמן ליטרלי להיפטר מהם. אוקיי? וזה קרה גם בסובייטים, וזה קורה בכל מקום, וגם זה קרה אגב גם באיראן, שהיה את הברית של הקומוניסטים והאסלאמיסטים, האסלאמיסטים ניצחו בעזרת הקומוניסטים, ואז הם נפטרו מהקומוניסטים. ואגב, גם ברוסיה, פלג מסוים של קומוניסטים הוא זה שהשיג את השלטון, ומיד טיהר את כל הפלגים הקומוניסטים האחרים. זה דפוס חוזר ברודנויות, שבעצם יש שילוב כוחות כאשר נלחמים נגד החירות, נגד הקפיטליזם, נגד איזשהו משטר שהפרט עדיין חופשי בו לחשוב ולפעול. ברגע שצורה אחת של המהות המרושעת הזו עולה לשלטון, היא מיד תיפטר משלל הצורות האחרות. גם, כן, שוב, ולי באופן אישי מה שמפריע באיך שאנשים מסתכלים על זה, הם מתמקדים בצורה ולא במהות. זאת אומרת, האנשים נותנים אישור מוסרי לקומוניסטים כי היטלר נפטר מהם שעולה לשלטון. כמו יש את השיר הזה על שלקחו את הקומוניסטים, לא אמרתי דבר כי לא הייתי קומוניסט, בסוף באו ולקחו אותי ולא נשאר אף אחד שידבר בעדי. אז העניין פה הוא המהות, והקומוניסטים הם רשעים גם כן. ורק היה לי חשוב להגיד את הנקודה הזאת. וזהו, אז עכשיו אנחנו בשלב שממש אנחנו רואים כיצד היטלר הופך את גרמניה לרודנות. כן, בוא, תודה.
The country's young people were sent to educational institutions from kindergarten to university, which had been completely Aryanized. The youngsters joined the Hitler Youth at age 6. The children declared that they would never speak of I, but only of we. Through the agency of 3 new guilds, the food estate, the estate of trade and industry, and the labor front, the government assumed control of every group of producers and consumers in the country. In accordance with the method of German socialism, the facade of a market economy was retained. All prices, wages, and interest rates, however, were fixed by the central authority. They were prices, wages, and interest rates in appearance only. In reality, they were merely determinations of quantity relations in the government's orders. This is socialism in the outward guise of capitalism.
זה גם מאוד מאוד חשוב, אוקיי? כי גם על זה יש הרבה דיון ער ויאמן. הם העמידו פנים של כלכלת שוק, בעוד בפועל זה הכל, הדבר הכי קרוב לכלכלת שוק שאני יכול לתאר את זה, להבדיל מקומוניזם ששם ממש הכל מולם באופן מפורש, אז פה זה במקסימום כלכלה ברשות. זאת אומרת, המשטר המרכזי מנהל הכל, הוא בסוף אם משהו מצא חן בעיניו זה לא יהיה, אבל הוא מאפשר לאנשים, כל עוד הם עושים משהו בהלימה עם המדיניות שלו, להעמיד פנים כאילו יש פה איזשהו שוק חופשי, מסחר חופשי שהמדינה כביכול לא מתערבת. כן.
The nation's businessmen retained the responsibility to produce and suffered the losses attendant on failure. The state determined the purpose and conditions of their production and reaped the benefits. Directly or indirectly, it expropriated all profits. The time is past, explained the Nazi Minister of Economics, when the notion of economic self-seeking and unrestricted use of profits made can be allowed to dominate. The economic system must serve the nation. What a Dummkopf I was, cried Steel Baron Fritz Thiesen, an early Nazi supporter who fled the country. By ordering a vast series of public works, then a massive rearmament program accompanied by military conscription, the Nazis ended unemployment. Nor did the Germans have to worry about job security any longer. Men were drafted into labor service by the government and attached to their jobs like medieval serfs. The serfs were carefully tended. The state insisted on the beautification of factories, recreational space for the workers, gardens on the factory grounds, better lighting and ventilation, and much more. The workers' leisure time was taken over. A comprehensive program of government lecture courses, art shows, vacation trips, and the like, the Strength Through Joy program, ensured that even away from their jobs, men never stopped hearing about the need to work and sacrifice for the community.
אז הנה עוד נקודה. כשהרודנות עולה על בסיס הרעיונות האלה, היא משתמשת במשאבים שהיא גוזרת על מנת להעצים את הרעיונות האלה עוד יותר. שטיפת המוח הנאצית הופעלה על מה שכבר הייתה אוהדת לרעיונות האלה, אולי לא בצורה הכי מפורשת, ואז היא בעצם בזזה אותם, ושטפה להם את המוח להיות עוד יותר פנאטים בעמדות האלה בצורה מפורשת.
As to Hitler's pledges to the poorer groups, the Republic's social insurance budgets were greatly increased, and a variety of welfare funds, programs, agencies, and policies were introduced or expanded, including special provisions for such items as unemployment relief, workmen's compensation, health insurance, pensions, winter help campaigns for the destitute, the Reich Mothers Service for indigent mothers and children, and the National Socialist People's Welfare Organization. In regard to fundamentals, Hitler kept his promises to the German people. Everyone in every class, field, and income bracket was manacled to the state. The state meant the party. The party takes over the function of what has been society. That is what I wanted them to understand, said Hitler to Rauschning.
אגב, זה המצב מאוד מאוד דומה היום, זה אנחנו רואים למשל בסין, של מדינת מפלגה. זו הדוגמה כרגע הכי גדולה.
The party is all-embracing. It rules over lives in all their breadth and depth. We must therefore develop branches of the party in which the whole of individual life will be reflected. Each activity and each need of the individual will thereby be regulated by the party as the representative of the general good. There will be no license, no free space in which the individual belongs to himself. This is socialism, not such trifles as the private possession of the means of production. Of what importance is that if I range men firmly within a discipline they cannot escape? Let them then own land or factories as much as they please. The decisive factor is that the state, through the party, is supreme over them, regardless of whether they are owners or workers. All that, you see, is unessential. Our socialism goes far deeper. The people about us are unaware of what is really happening to them. They gaze fascinated at one or two familiar superficialities, such as possessions and income and rank and other outworn conceptions. As long as these are kept intact, they are quite satisfied. But in the meantime, they have entered a new relation. A powerful social force has caught them up. They themselves are changed. What are ownership and income to that? Why need we trouble to socialize banks and factories? We socialize human beings.
מי אמר את זה?
היטלר אמור להגיד את זה לראושנינג, אבל בספר הזה, כמו שאני הבנתי מהיסטוריונים ומעיתונאות, הוא בעצם, כאילו, ראושנינג הוא היה פוליטיקאי נאצי שברח איכשהו לאנגליה, ורוב השיחות האלה עם היטלר זה שיחות שהוא כתב כאילו אחרי, כאילו, like in his own private diaries, he was recounting some version of a conversation that he had. So it's not like a quote from Hitler.
זה ממקור שני.
So it's like the table talks.
יש פה, אבל תקשיבו, זו אמירה מאוד מאוד מעניינת. הוא בעצם אומר את מה שדיברנו פה, כמעט ציטוט של היטלר. הוא מסביר, כן, ניתן להם להיות כביכול בעלי רכוש, ניתן להם כאילו להרגיש כאילו הם מנהלים את החיים של עצמם. בפועל, אנחנו שולטים בהכל, זה הכל של המפלגה, זה הכל של המדינה.
לרוסניג היה אינטרס לעוות את מה שהיטלר עשה או משהו?
יש על זה ויכוח היסטורי. נדב דיבר על זה באחד המפגשים הראשונים שלנו, והוא אמר שדווקא גינו את רפלין, אני חושב שהוא גם עוד לפני השואה הוא כתב על היטלר, וגינו אותו שהוא יותר מדי מציג את היטלר כאיזשהו רודן משוגע וכזה. והכן שגם אחרי השואה עדיין יש אנשים שמגנים את רפלין כאילו הוא
רפלין היה קפיטליסט או אנטי קפיטליסט בעמדות שלו אחר, כי הוא היה אנטי קפיטליסט, אז לא היה לו אינטרס להציג את היטלר.
בוא, אני לא חושב שזה כדאי להיכנס לזה עכשיו, לנסות להבין את רפלין והעומד, אולי אחרי המפגש. בוא נמשיך.
Living standards dropped for every major economic group and class. The government continuously seized more of the country's earnings. There was abundance only for the military. Guns will make us powerful. Butter will only make us fat, said Goering. The Germans had believed that Nazism was a practical solution to the Depression. Even before the war, they began to find out otherwise. After 1939, they learned still more. But disaster as such does not change a country's mind or its ideas. No matter how they were exploited or what hardships they suffered, the Germans accepted Hitler's rule. The Nazi reign of terror is merely one part of the reason. The policies and statements of every group still able to speak in the 30s reveal the other part.
זה בדיוק העניין שדיברנו, זה נכון שהיה את הטרור של המפלגה הנאצית ואת הגשטאפו, שאוי ואבוי למי שידבר נגד הלך הרוח השולט, אבל עדיין הנחות היסוד זה הנחות היסוד של רוב האנשים ברפובליקת ויימאר. זה פשוט ביטוי רודני שלהם, של הנחות יסוד רודניות.
The respectable German right rallied behind the swastika from the beginning. The Protestant clergy explained that it saw in the new government the chance for a moral renaissance, which would nourish religious feeling, obedience to authority, and the spirit of sacrifice. The centrists put The centrists protested when the Nazis interfered with Catholic activities or interests, but conceded Hitler's achievements, including in one bishop's summary, the defeat of communism, the introduction of the Führer principle, the reinforcement of moral power, and the banning of streetwalkers. On June 10th, 1933, the Catholic prelates issued a lengthy pastoral. They recognized, they said, that the individual is part of a larger organism and must work not simply for himself, but for the common good. Furthermore, just because authority plays such a prominent role in Catholic affairs, they can well understand the emphasis now placed upon it in relation to the state. The prelates added a reservation. The government, they said, should not curtail human freedom more than the general welfare warrants. That many Germans of intellectual as well as of more simple mentality could at the very same time worship the God on the cross and idolize the Führer is one of those irrational aberrations of the human spirit that can merely be described but not intelligently explained, writes Pinson. Perhaps the fact is not quite so baffling as he suggests. The country's secular moderates, such as the one-time Democrats, spoke their mind also. Their reaction to Hitler is epitomized by a remark of Hashlamar Schacht, a founder of the Democratic Party who became Nazi Minister of Economics. This man, said Dr. Schacht in 1935, set about first to raise the moral standard of the nation. That is why I think him a great man. He has raised the moral standard of the people. The German left was not free to speak publicly. Many communists in particular disappeared in Nazi jails or escaped abroad. The Marxists who survived, however, did not challenge Hitler's basic viewpoint. The absolute state is right, they said in effect, but we could have run it better. This kind of objection posed no threat to the Nazi rule, nor did it prevent another disciple of Marx from recognizing a community of values with Hitler and acting accordingly. In August 1939, the statesmen of the West, who had long derogated abstract principles, were struck dumb by the signing of the Hitler-Stalin Pact.
אוקיי, בואו נעצור רגע. בעצם אנחנו רואים פה פירוט קונקרטי של הטענה. הנה כל האנשים שהם לא נאצים, ואיך העמדות שלהם בעצם השתלבו עם העמדה הנאצית, בין אם זה הקתולים שמתחברים למוסר שהיטלר מקדם, ולסמכותנות שיש בנצרות, אז אין גם סמכותנות למדינה, ההסתכלות של הקומוניסטים, או שהקומוניסטים שהועלמו או ברחו, אז זה דבר אחד, אבל אלה שנשארו בסוף אמרו, כן, אנחנו מאמצים את ההנחת יסוד של מדינה רודנית טוטליטרית, פשוט צריך רודנות קומוניסטית ולא רודנות נאצית, וכאלה ואחרים. בוא, אז יש לך משהו להוסיף על זה?
לא, אין לי משהו להוסיף לזה.
אוקיי, אז בוא נמשיך.
As to the men who ultimately shaped the ideas of the country's political groups, i.e. the intellectuals, the overwhelming majority forgot their scruples against rowdiness. Illustrious Nobel Prize-winning names eagerly backed the Nazi cause and flocked to embrace the brutes. Professor Eugen Lüttigen, an authority in philosophy and law at Bonn, named the belief at the root of the embrace in a statement praising and justifying the book burning. The voice of blood, he said, speaks a louder language than that of the intellect. The remnants of the Weimar leadership in every field and almost without exception rushed to agree with the principles of the Nazis. The rush was often opportunism or appeasement, but the agreement was real. The state which Hitler established did, in fact, embody the fundamental ideas of Germany's political cultural tradition. Many Germans still did not like Hitler's personality or associates or tactics. They swallowed their reaction down. They could not challenge the essence and climax of their own long-cherished basic premises. Did an action of their new rulers make no sense to the Germans? They reminded themselves that reason is nothing and that feeling or authority is all. Did men never have a moment to breathe free of a noisy, hiling, swastika-waving mob? They reminded themselves that the individual is nothing and that the Volk is all. Was every group terrorized, enslaved, and ruthlessly milked dry? The Germans were willing to endure these conditions. Selflessness is in the sense that oneself does not matter. The feeling of being expendable was no longer the expression of individual idealism, but a mass phenomenon, writes Hannah Arendt. The Germans remembered their age-old vision of national greatness defined by discipline, obedience, and self-abnegation. They remembered Kant's idea that the principle of one's own happiness is the most objectionable of all, and that self-love is the very source of evil. They grasped that now that they had their historic chance, the chance to suppress the evil and to make the vision a reality, they seized the chance and they acted on it. At last, the Germans were practicing in full the philosophy they had been taught.
אוקיי, אז סיימנו את הפרק, פרק קצר וקשוח, על העלייה של היטלר ועל כך שבעצם הוא נשען על אותם רעיונות, והנה זה בא לידי ביטוי, והנה הציבור למעשה מקבל את זה, או לא מסוגל להתנגד לרעיונות שהוא מקבל את הנחות היסוד שלהם. השעה עכשיו 7:35, אז או שאנחנו ניקח עכשיו הפסקה של 10 דקות רבע שעה, או שנמשיך בפרק הבא. הפסקה? בסדר גמור, אז אנחנו נחזור ב-7:47.
יער, הייתה לי שאלה אחת לגבי, כאילו, אתה אמרת משהו שנדב הסביר משהו על ראושנינג, כאילו מי הוא היה וכל זה?
כן.
פשוט לא שמעתי את זה שדיברתם על זה.
אז אפשר, אני אבקש מנדב שיבוא במפגש הבא ואולי ידבר על כמה דקות.
טוב.
בסדר גמור.
עדיין לא צועק.
בועז שומע אותנו?
כן, אני שומע, מה נשמע?
פאקי וידאו? עוד לא.
You cannot start your video because it's disabled by the host.
ועכשיו?
Start my video. אוקיי, לא, זה לא עובד. כן, זה עובד. אוקיי. All right.
אוקיי, אז אנחנו בפרק 13, מחנות הריכוז.
The men, women, and children who were to become the looted corpses or the living skeletons of the Nazi concentration camp system were seized in Germany, then across Europe by the hundreds and thousands, then by the millions. They were seized from homes, offices, factories, farms, schools, and even at random from fields and streets. The transportation of the prisoners to the camps followed a certain pattern. According to Bruno Bettelheim, a survivor of Buchenwald and a brilliant observer of camp life, the nature of the trip was part of a definite plan. The newly arrested prisoners were taunted, screamed at, slapped, gouged, kicked, whipped, bayoneted, and or shot. Some were killed immediately. Some were ordered to stare into lights or to kneel for hours. Some were forced to hit or beat other prisoners. Some were forced to curse themselves, their loved ones, and their most precious values. Under threat of instant death, none dared utter a murmur of protest or make a gesture of self-defense or move a step to help a wife or husband lying in plain sight, bleeding and dying. The tortures became less and less violent, Bettelheim reports, to the degree that prisoners stopped resisting and complied immediately with any SS order, even the most outrageous. Longtime prisoners, he adds, who often happened to be returning to camps on the same train with newcomers, were left alone by the SS as soon as they made their status known as prisoners already initiated. At the end of the trip, the victims were stripped of clothes, hair, name, and sometimes left for hours in silence to wait for the unknown. In other transports, there were no SS orders or beatings. Prisoners were herded into freight cars, crammed naked against one another, driven back and forth senselessly, sometimes for days, then deposited in extermination centers and turned over to trained torturers, or fed directly into gas chambers. In the camps, prisoners were starved. Food became an obsession. A piece of bread or a spoonful of soup was often the difference between life and death. Prisoners were overworked. They often collapsed on the job. Rest became an obsession. When men were forced to stand outdoors for hours with nothing but rags to protect them from freezing cold. They were covered with filth, lacking the facilities even to wash properly. They were ravaged by disease. They were followed every moment by the threat of beatings, torture, murder. The threat extended even to the latrine. Men were occasionally pushed from their seats into mounds of excrement. Some suffocated to death as the guards watched. Prisoners did not suffer from sexual frustration. Most did not experience the need for sex at all, even in their dreams. Sex is a celebration of life. It is a form of affirmation and incompatible with the concentration camp. After 2 or 3 weeks of the regime at Majdanek, a survivor reports, describing an all but universal reaction, sex problems disappeared. Women lost their periods. Men lost their urge. The prisoners spent their time building installations, making armaments, or turning out, for the private use of the SS, luxuries of every kind, from greeting cards to living room furniture. The prisoners' output, however, was relatively meager. The conditions were the opposite of what production or even productive slave labor would have required, a fact recognized by the SS and accepted by the party leadership. Economic considerations, camp officials were told repeatedly, should fundamentally remain unconsidered. Political considerations did not seem to matter either. The camp population did include political prisoners, as well as criminals, homosexuals, so-called asocial types, and others whose arrest was in some way related to their ideas or behavior. But such men were a minority. The great majority of the inmates, including millions of Jews, were apolitical, law-abiding, normal. They were innocent of any opposition to Hitler's government and of any specific crime. According to the Nazi ideology, the Jews were guilty by nature. Yet it was a guilt unrelated to their actions. Most had planned or done nothing forbidden by or harmful to the Nazis, a fact known to the men who arrested, tortured, and murdered them.
זו נקודה חשובה. כי שים לב מה זה אומר על העמדה והשקפת העולם של מי שביצע את הרצח וההשמדה, אוקיי? הם ידעו שאותם אנשים, היהודים במקרה הזה, לא עשו שום מעשה ושום דבר שפגע בהם, שהם היו דמויות א-פוליטיות, אוקיי? זה לא שזה, אתה יודע, אתה רואה בן אדם שהוא לחלוטין חף מפשע, ואתה מוכן להשלים עם העינוי והרצח שלו וההשמדה שלו. אוקיי?
זה פעילי טרור.
מה?
הוא פעילי טרור.
כן. כן, אבל פה זה טרור מטעם המדינה.
פעילי טרור.
עוד נקודה חשובה פה, באתי את זה רגע, לא, זה מה אתה רציתי להגיד, בסדר, כן.
Okay. Judging by the long-term trend, the Jews were to be only the beginning. Despite his stress on anti-Semitism, Hitler's agenda of destruction systematically escalated. It soon included the Poles, the Ukrainians, the Russians, and other nationalities. Later, it grew to include even various categories of loyal, racially pure Germans, e.g., those with lung or heart disease. The Soviets, Hannah Arendt points out, have exhibited a similar development in this regard, moving from the destruction of the pre-revolutionary ruling classes to that of the kulaks, the Russians of Polish origin, and other groups, on through the latest target, Russian Jewry. In essence, the Nazis did not care which races inhabited the concentration camps. They imposed no restrictions on admission. What they wanted was not a group of specifically defined victims, but human material as such and in quantity. Every aspect of the prisoner's life in the camps was controlled by the SS men. Everything was forbidden to him except what was ordered or specially authorized. Any form of independent action was punished. A man needed permission to possess even the most insignificant object, such as a scrap of extra cloth, to protect him from the cold. He needed permission to eat, to speak, to wash, to defecate. Prisoners could grasp no reason for the camp rules. Warum? Why? A parched prisoner at Auschwitz once asked a guard who had forbidden him to touch an icicle. Hier ist kein Warum. There is no why here, was the answer. In place of why, there was whim, the seemingly causeless, inexplicable whim of the SS.
אוקיי, שוב, זה עוד נקודה חשובה, עכשיו אנחנו ממש רואים בפועל את הביטוי של האידיאולוגיה הזאת. אין סיבות, אין למה, אין תכלית, יש את הגחמות של קצין האפס. זה מה שיש.
When the prisoners at Buchenwald awoke, they had to rush frantically, often at the price of ignoring urgent bodily needs to perform the time-consuming, difficult, and utterly pointless task of making their straw beds with absolute precision. The mattresses had to be perfectly flat, the sides perfectly rectangular. In addition, the whole row of beds and mattresses had to be in perfect alignment. Some SS checked with yardsticks and levels to make sure that the beds were built correctly. When the prisoners reached the work site, they might be ordered to perform some graspable task, or without any explanation, to fill a cart with sand without using shovels lying in plain view, or to carry heavy rocks to a certain spot, then back again to the original position, or to build a fence, then destroy it, then rebuild it. When the prisoners lined up for the next in a continual series of roll calls and inspections, they might be inspected or ignored for hours, or forced to roll through heaps of gravel as sport, or whipped on the spot, sometimes to the accompaniment of rollicking songs sung under orders by other prisoners. No one could know what to expect next. Even when men were admitted to the camp hospital, they could not know. It was a matter of caprice whether their fate was to be medical treatment or drawn-out vivisection or immediate murder. Nothing was certain but inexplicable pain. The unpredictability was a torture by itself, even apart from all the rest. A group of Czechs at one camp were given special privileges and comforts, then thrown into quarries and subjected to the worst living conditions, then back again into good quarters and easy work, and after a few months back into the quarries with little food, etc. Soon they all died. The caprice of the Nazis was senseless. It served no existential objective, but it was the law of the realm. Paraphrasing Tertullian, it was the law because it was senseless. The prisoner in the concentration camps soon learned that his function was not compliance with delimited goal-directed orders, however harsh or brutal. He learned that what his torturers demanded of him was not his achievement of specific objectives, or his understanding, or any kind of initiative, but a single trait: unconditional obedience. The best theoretical interpreter of the concentration camps is Hannah Arendt. The camps, she stated, are the culmination of the central totalitarian motive. Fundamentally, she holds the camps are laboratories in total domination. The camps, Miss Arendt writes, serve the ghastly experiment of eliminating, under scientifically controlled conditions, spontaneity itself as an expression of human behavior and of transforming the human personality into a mere thing, into something that even animals are not. Under normal circumstances, this can never be accomplished because spontaneity can never be entirely eliminated insofar as it is connected not only with freedom, human freedom, but with life itself, in the sense of simply keeping alive. It is only in the concentration camps that such an experiment is at all possible. The end result of the experiment, she writes, is ghastly marionettes with human faces, which all behave like the dog in Pavlov's experiments. The camps, writes Bettelheim, drawing the same kind of conclusion from his own experience, are an experimental laboratory designed to learn the most effective ways of breaking resistance in a defenseless civilian population. One major goal was to break the prisoners as individuals and to change them into a docile mass from which no individual or group act of resistance could arise. The camps, a recent study sums up in an apt comparison, have so far been the closest thing on earth to a perfect Skinner box. They were a closed, completely regulated environment, a total world in the strict sense. Pain and death were the negative reinforcers, food and life the positive reinforcers, and all these forces were pulling and shoving 24 hours a day at the deepest stratum of human need. In many of the camps, prisoners were interned for lengthy periods. Death was put off, perhaps indefinitely. In the special extermination camps, a brief violent trauma was inflicted on the prisoners, after which they were slaughtered immediately in vast groups. In either case, the essential goal of the camp system was not death as such. It was not the physical destruction of the victim that the Nazis primarily sought, but his psychological destruction, i.e., the collapse of his capacity to function independently. A man might be allowed to keep his life for a while, his sanity, and even his physical strength, enough to carry out orders. What he had to give up, what he was methodically reinforced, processed, conditioned to give up, was that within him which made him an autonomous, self-directed entity. The young SS men on duty in the camps also received a certain kind of reinforcement or processing. They too, though in somewhat different form, had to be trained to give up their independence and autonomy. They had to be turned into creatures who would question nothing and carry out anything, i.e., into the unflinchingly obedient elite corps on which the whole Hitlerite system relied. The camp personnel learned obedience by doing the kinds of things normal men did not do and could not have conceived. The prisoners were helpless. The SS had a choice. They could try to escape or at least seek duty outside the camps. Those, the great majority who did not try it, but merely went along with their assignments, could not be called victims. They were accessories, morally responsible for what they became. For about a year, the camps were run by the thugs of the SA, a group which included many freewheeling sadists, perverts, and psychopaths eager for an orgy of hatred and torture. The SS, who took over the camps after the Rome Purge and the fall of the SA, were a different breed. For the most part, the guards and administrators were ordinary men, at least at the beginning. They did not particularly hate the prisoners or lust after blood. As a rule, they were more interested in time off than in another chance to inflict torture. When the SS took over, writes Miss Arendt, the old spontaneous bestiality gave way to an absolutely cold and systematic destruction of human bodies, calculated to destroy human dignity. Death was avoided or postponed indefinitely. The camps were no longer amusement parks for beasts in human form, that is, for men who really belonged in mental institutions and prisons. The reverse became true. They were turned into drill grounds on which perfectly normal men were trained to be full-fledged members of the SS. Ideological indoctrination alone, it was found, could not create a corps of full-fledged Nazis. But the daily practice of concentration camp scale unreason could and did. The camps and all their seemingly inexplicable horrors were aimed not only at the victims, but also at the killers. The victims had to become robots, slavishly obedient to the guards. The guards had to become robots, slavishly obedient to the Führer. In both cases, some fundamental element in men had to be destroyed by the camp experience, an element unidentified but taken for granted by most people. It is the element which in a normal man underlies and makes possible such attributes as independence, autonomy, self-direction, spontaneity. What is this element, and by what method did the camps undertake to eradicate it? What specifically did the camp rulers wage war on and seek to destroy in man?
אוקיי, בואו נעצור רגע. קראנו עכשיו חלק מאוד מאוד קשוח, ולפני שאנחנו נמשיך, אני רוצה שנעצור רגע נעכל את זה ואולי נדבר על זה קצת.
אני חושב שהיום כרגע יש את הדבר הזה בצפון קוריאה, יש את הדבר הזה בסודאן, דברים שיכולים להיות אפילו יותר גרועים ממה שאנחנו רואים כרגע. לצערי אין עיתונאים, אולי באריתריאה יש גם דברים נוראים, כי פשוט אין עיתונאים. אז זה נדמה כאילו שזה פרק בהיסטוריה כזה, אבל המציאות קיימת, זה אכן כך.
אני זוכר, אני ראיתי ביוטיוב סרטון בן אדם שחררו אותו מהכלא ברוסיה כדי שהוא ילך להילחם במלחמה באוקראינה, והוא מאוד דומה לזה, שהתייחסו אליו, מה שחררו אותו לעשות.
מה אתם חושבים על תוכן העניין הזה של בעצם האנשי אס-אס? קודם כל שהם נושאים אחריות מוסרית למה שהם עושים, כי הם יכלו לבקש תפקיד אחר, או לברוח, או לעשות משהו. והאספקט השני זה שיש פה גם תהליך מטורף של השחתה עצמית בפועל.
מעבר לזה, אני חושב, נגיד, אני הייתי במקום נגיד שאני שטוף מוח בכל מובן אפשרי, אני שם, וכולם מתנהגים ככה, כל התירוצים האלה אפשריים. ואני מניח שכל שבוע, שבועיים, חודש, חודשיים, הם עושים הביתה. יום, יומיים, שלושה, וחוזרים למחנה הזה. זה לא כאילו שקצין היה שם 6 שנים, או 3 שנים, או משהו כזה. הם מגיעים הביתה, ומה הם אומרים לאישה, לילדים, ולחברים, ואז הם ברצון חוזרים לשם.
הם אומרים שהם עושים את המוטל שלהם, הם עושים את המוטל עליהם, למען אומה גרמנית.
Yes, אנשי ה-SS הם הגיעו לשם למשפחות שלהם, כאילו במיוחד ה-SS. קודם כל להיות ב-SS זה להיות כאילו בגיל 30 ומשהו, 40 ומשהו, בן אדם שהוא צריך להוכיח שהוא מוסרי בתחומים של הנאצים. אז כאילו, most of these men were married and their families came with them. They don't talk about what they're doing.
לא, אני חושב שהמפקדים, נגיד המפקד מחנה, גר שם במשפחה שלו, אבל קצינים זוטרים יותר לא היו במשפחה שלו.
מה זאת אומרת, המשפחה הייתה איתו?
נגיד מחנה, לא יודע, בוכנברג. אז יש מחנה, והמפקד של המחנה, יש לו בית במחנה, והוא גר שם עם המשפחה שלו.
המשפחה שלו מודעת למה שהוא עושה?
ברור.
It was possible to not be aware of lots of details. I mean, I don't think that it was dinner table conversation, and there were members of the family that didn't go anywhere near where they would see really horrible crimes, like on a daily basis. But you know, it's impossible not to be aware after 3 or 4 weeks in that environment that you're surrounded by death.
יש סיפור על מפקד מחנה, כאילו על אשתו של מפקד מחנה שהייתה סדיסטית והייתה משתתפת פעילה בהתעללות בעינויים, ואפילו הייתה עושה, נגיד הייתה מכינה ההיא למנורה מאור של קורבנות.
מה הסיפור עליהם?
מה הסיפור עליהם?
אמרת יש סיפור.
מה לא, אז מספרים מה הייתה עושה בהתעללות וזה.
מה שאני שמעתי שהמחנות היו מסוג של משהו שהם שמרו בסוד מהציבור הגרמני הרחב.
כן. אבל זה
מאוד
היה,
מידה מסוימת.
אני חושב שזה היה סוד גלוי. הרוב לא ידעו, אבל מי שרצה להבין מה קורה, שאל דרכים להבין. וגם, תשמע, הם ראו שהיהודים נעלמים, הם ראו שהקומוניסטים נעלמים, הם ראו כאילו מי שמתנגד למשטר נעלם. אני מניח שהיה גם מסורת להורג גלויות.
וזה טוב.
ואז היית אומר לא, ואז זה סתם יהודי.
הם ראו בזה כדבר טוב, לא אנשים רעים, או שהם פשוט לא אנושיים, צריך להתייחס
זה
להם.
פשוט לא, זה כנראה עדיף לאומה שהם יעלמו.
אני זוכר, אני קראתי פעם איזה ספר על מישהו שהיה מרגל בגרמניה, וכשהוא אמר לאנשים על המחנות, האנשים לא האמינו לו.
אבל זה יכול גם הכחשה, זאת אומרת, זה יכול גם עניין שבאמת כאילו, אתה יודע, הם מאמינים בנרטיב.
גם היום אתה מסתכל על מעשים של פלסטינאים ב7 באוקטובר, יש אנשים שלא מאמינים למרות העדויות אפילו.
גם זה שמישהו אומר שהוא לא מאמין, זה לא בהכרח אומר שהוא לא מאמין, אולי הם פחדו להאמין, כי אז הם מאמינים.
בחרו,
אולי בואו מחר עצרו אותם, הם יגידו שהם מאמינים בדבר כזה, לא יודע.
בחרו לעשות טבעי, זה לא להאמין באופן מודע, כי זה לא נוח להאמין.
טוב, בואו נמשיך.
רגע, איפה אנחנו?
אנחנו בשלוש כוכביות, אבל בואו נקרא את הפסקה הקטנה לפני זה. השאלה היא בעצם, מה במחנות ריכוז האלו רצו להרוס באדם? מה זה הדבר הזה ספציפית שרצו להשליט באדם במחנות האלה? דיברנו הרי על ההשמדה הפסיכולוגית של האדם.
גאווה.
בואו נראה.
The process began at the beginning with a selection of prisoners who had done nothing wrong and who could not understand why they had been arrested. Hannah Arendt was the first to identify the camp's need of innocent inmates. She explains the policy in socio-political terms as part of a deliberate Nazi and Soviet attempt to kill the juridical person in man, i.e., to destroy the concept of man's rights. Criminals, Miss Arendt observes, are not proper subjects for a concentration camp. However brutally he is treated by the camp guards, the criminal knows why he is there. He is able to grasp a causal relationship between his actions and his fate. To that extent, he retains a certain human dignity. He remains within the normal pre-totalitarian frameworks of crime and punishment. He remains within the realm where justice, by some definition, is relevant and where a man's rights are a reality to be respected or at least considered. If, however, one deliberately arrests men who have done nothing and tortures them methodically for no reason at all, then the normal framework is thrown out, and even the pretense at justice in any definition disappears. The contemptuous, sweeping rejection of man's rights becomes a principle of the system, and the victim is effectively stripped of human status. Thus, the camp's need of innocent inmates. Thus, also, the fact that those criminals picked for the camps were sent there as a rule only after they had completed their term in prison and were legally free. Under no circumstances, Miss Arendt summarizes, must the concentration camp become a calculable punishment for definite offenses. If internment were made dependent on any definition of crime or heresy, no matter how perverse or tyrannical, the camps would become superfluous. It would make for a new system of justice, which, given any stability at all, could not fail to produce a new juridical person in man that would elude the totalitarian domination. I was just thinking about the connection between this chapter and the prior one.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the rise of the Nazis, like the way that Pikoff captures it in the very beginning, of the previous chapter was that it didn't take very long for the Nazis to seize power and to really the rule of complete arbitrary force. All parliament, the society destroyed all its protections and didn't fight for itself at all. None, and it didn't fight for any aspect of liberty or rule of law. And if you saw daily life in the previous few years, it's like the Nazis were a presence. They were a bigger and bigger presence. And what was the presence? The presence were like just brutal force, organized brutal force that when it's unleashed is like a frenzy, like that they're enjoying themselves. So it's like you have these young people with guns or with whatever, right? And once in a while, the leader of this pack unleashes them, and this becomes normal. It becomes normal because you have prosecutions, but the judges are many times on the side of the right-wing organizations, whichever they are. And they feel for them. They think that they're like, these guys are acting out from some form of virtue. And that everyone saw this, and then people voted for it. And when they saw that this party won, then that gave them like authority. Like you have a bunch of gangsters who use brute force, and they get away with it. And then they don't just get away with it, they win an election. And then the election, gives them some sort of moral authority. Then these other groups sanction them. The conservatives give them more power. So each additional resignation, each additional sanction, right, gives them even more power. And then, and you have this in this chapter, you have the point. What is Arendt saying? Arendt is saying that there was no practical purpose to these concentration camps other than to instill irrational obedience. Like, you're here just to obey. Your role in life is to obey. That's what's important. That's what's important in life. And the people who were in charge, what were they getting, right? I mean, so you have, on the one hand, you're as somebody who's coming up in this sort of organization, you have to take orders, you have to obey. Your sense of independence and autonomy is stripped from you, and then you feel good. It reinforces your sense of belonging to this organization, but then you get some perks, and the perks are you get a sense that your people are inherently superior. Like, you get to give out the orders. And why? Why are you there? Why do you have this authority over these people? Some 24-year-old kid is there with a gun, brutalizing men who are in their 60s. And why do they get to do this? Because why? Because nature, like in their sense of nature, their sense of like, it's like the medieval system of orders. Like, God put us on earth to rule. So for a moment, they get to enjoy this. This is the, and what's incredible, what's incredible about this whole time period is that people treated this as if it was normal. Millions and millions and millions of people went along with this. And then for 30 years after, until today, generally, I think society, people forget. It's not just that they forget, they didn't learn, but like they pretend like this was some sort of, this was just some sort of disturbance in the force or something. Like there was this temporary period where people went crazy, and it's like a cartoon with cartoon villains. And we don't have to take any other lessons from it. But the lesson that we have to take from it, and that I think basically only Israelis and Jews actually feel as a normal part of life, is that it is a reasonable danger. It's a reasonable thing to be afraid that societies are going to go completely crazy, and pick a victim and destroy that victim. And that this is something we should expect to happen.
היה ניצול שואה, אני לא זוכר מי, שהוא זוכר שלמדתי באוניברסיטה פעם, שהוא חשב שזה פלנטה אחרת, עצם העובדה ש... מי?
קצ'טני.
כן, הוא אמר שעצם העובדה שמנסים להסביר את הנאציזם, למצוא סיבות פילוסופיות, כלכליות, פוליטיות, למצוא סיבות זה די קרוב מדי לטעמו ולהצדיק. כאילו, הם עשו את השואה בגלל שהיה להם בעיות כלכליות. כן, נראה לי שהוא בסוף התחרט על זה או משהו.
כן, בסוף הוא הלך, הוא עבר תהליך מאוד רציני.
מי זה?
כן, אתה באוניברסיטה זה מישהו שתקף את עצם הרעיון של למצוא סיבות לשואה, כאילו למצוא סיבות כלכליות, פוליטיות, זה כמו להצדיק מבחינתו, הוא התחרט על זה בסוף.
השאלה המעניינת פה זה האם זה היה יד הגורל, או האם, לא יד הגורל,
לא יד הגורל,
המטאפיזי, האם זה היה חינוך שהביא לזה, או שלאנשים באמת את הבחירה לעשות את מה שהם עושים?
גם וגם, כאילו גם היה את החינוך, אבל היה כאלה שבחרו לחשוב באופן עצמי ולדחות את החינוך, ויש כאלה שבחרו ללכת עם העדר. זה מזכיר לי הסצנה, אנחנו דיברנו על זה שהיה את השרירותי, יש ברשימת שינדלר, את הסצנה הקצין הזה, שמישהו אומר, אני טעיתי למה הוא ירד דווקא באיש או האישה הספציפיים האלה, מה ייחד אותם, ואז ענו לה, לא חצנה בדיוק, בגלל שלא היה שום דבר שייחד אותו, בגלל שהשרירותי הוא עשה את זה, הקצין. בעלת הצנף פילדר משכנע אותו, להפגין חמלה באופן שרירותי זה גם סוג של הפגנת כוח, כאילו זה שאתה הורג באופן שרירותי ומציל באופן שרירותי, זה כאילו הרעיון הזה של לקחת או לא לקחת חיים באופן שרירותי זה חלק מאוד חשוב בחוויה שלהם.
וזה קשור לעניין הזה שבאמת אתה מבטל את הצדק, אתה מבטל את הקונספט של זכות, אתה נותן לאנשים משהו שלא מגיע להם.
כן, יש הרבה כאלה באופי שלהם, אתה שואל אותם למה לעשות ככה, לא הסמכות, הם אומרים ככה.
אבל יש פה משהו ממש ממוסד בצורה של השלטון והפילוסופיה שלו, שזה המחנות ריכוז האלה, זה למעשה הביטוי האולטימטיבי של משטרים כאלה. זה התכלית הסופית.
אני מזכיר לי את העולם הזה שאלסבורג טורי...
כן, גם האמת שקראתי על האופן שבו קציני אס-אס התנהגו לאסירים, זה ממש הזכיר לי את האופן שבו טורי רוצה שיתייחסו לאונרד רום. אני רואה בזה ממש הקבלה מדויקת. כן, בוא.
אני בעצם לא הבנתי את הנקודה האחרונה על טורי ורוק.
טורי אומר בפאונטנהד שהוא רוצה שרוק יהיה אסיר, שהוא יהיה כבול, שהוא יהיה נשלט. ושקראנו על הקציני אס-אס והיחס שלהם לאסירים, זה היה כזה. זה ממש ראיתי שם את טורי.
מה אם אני רצה בעצם משהו מעורב דומה?
מה הוא רצה?
רוצה שיצירות אומנות יהיו, או שאומנים גדולים יהיו, יוריד להם את כל הכבוד ואת כל הבחירה האישית שלהם.
אני חושב שוואנד זה מקום אחר, זה מקום של
ציניות.
כן.
טוב, shall we move on?
כן.
The actual results of the camp's policy in this matter support Miss Arend's viewpoint. The criminals were the prisoners least devastated by their arrest. They found their internment easiest to endure and became the camp aristocracy everywhere. Conversely, according to Bettelheim, those worst hit psychologically were the law-abiding apolitical members of the German middle class. These men, many of whom had sympathized with the Hitler regime, had no inkling of any reason, legal, political, or philosophical, to explain their fate. And this was a fact which they could not deal with or bear. The prisoner, noted the commandant of Auschwitz in his autobiography, can cope with stern but impartial severity, however harsh it may be. But tyranny and manifestly unjust treatment affect his soul like a blow with a club. The concept of rights or of justice is not a philosophic primer, though Miss Arendt often seems to treat it as such. What she identifies only as the attack on the juridical person is, in fact, part of a wider, all-embracing assault. To give a man's soul this kind of blow is one step in the process of plunging him into a certain kind of world. All the other steps continued the process. The salient feature of the camp world was not merely injustice or even horror, but horror which was unintelligible to the victim. When they arrived at the camps, many of the prisoners, dazed by their arrest and nightmare transport, did not know what was happening to them or even where they were. As a rule, the Nazis told them nothing and answered no questions. The guards' manner was that of a response to the self-evident. They behaved as if the prisoners were creatures with no faculty of intelligence, or as if the prisoners had now entered a realm in which such a faculty was irrelevant. In the larger society, the Nazis counted heavily on the power of ideology. There is no other way to rule an entire country. The dissemination of ideology, however, any ideology, even the Nazi one, implicitly underscores the importance of ideas, of individual choice and judgment, of the listener's mind. In the camps, no such implication was to be permitted. No attempt was made to present the Nazi viewpoint to the prisoners. There were no self-justifying speeches, no summaries of Mein Kampf, no propaganda, no proselytizing. Education in the camps, declared Himmler, consists of discipline, never of any kind of instruction on an ideological basis. The SS did not want the prisoners' intellectual acceptance of Nazism and rebuffed any overtures from would-be converts. When certain prisoners sought to make their peace with the Gestapo, Bettelheim reports, the Gestapo's response was to insist that prisoners refrain from expressing any of their feelings, even pro-Nazi ones. Free consent, observes Miss Arendt, is as much an obstacle to total domination as free opposition. The camp rulers would not tolerate a prisoner's concerning himself with ideas of any kind, whether Nazi or otherwise. Ideas are irrelevant to an inmate. This was the guiding idea. In Buchenwald and Auschwitz, thought has no place. Neither, the inmates soon learned, did individuality have any place. When a prisoner entered the camp, he brought with him the knowledge achieved by civilized Western man. It was self-evident to him that he, like all men, was a separate entity with a unique identity. The camps proceeded methodically to flout this self-evidency. Characteristically, the guards did not know or seek to know anything about any particular inmate beyond his group membership. Often they failed or deliberately refused to recognize any difference at all between one prisoner and another. An eerie egalitarianism prevailed. To the SS, the things being manipulated by screams, kicks, and guns were not separate human entities, each with his own appearance, character, and life. They were indistinguishable cells of an undifferentiated mass, faceless units made of agony, filth, and groveling, each equal to and interchangeable with hundreds or millions of other such units. Personal responsibility was not recognized in the camps. If a prisoner took an action regarded as punishable, he was not treated as the culprit. Instead, so far as possible, every member of the group to which he belonged, including himself, was punished for the action, regardless of any member's own behavior or knowledge of the incident. All were punished equally, ruthlessly, and as a group. Outside the camps, a variant of this method was practiced. The police would intimidate some dissatisfied group, e.g. doctors or lawyers, by arresting a random cross-section of its members without reference to any individual's action, guilt, or innocence. Since the prisoners knew that all could be punished for the acts of any one man, they often feared and tried to stop independent action on the part of other inmates, even action aimed at helping prisoners in special need or danger. Thus, feats of heroic courage were often condemned by the beneficiaries themselves, and the heroes, in Bettelheim's words, were kept from rekindling respect for the individual or from inspiring an appreciation of independence. This, by the way, is like really typical of the Soviet policy. Whenever, especially when they took over territories, when they took over Latvia and Poland, and when they were taking over Hungary after a year of letting the Nazis cleanse it, the first people they destroyed, the first people they took were anybody that showed any sign of independence. The people that came out to help the Soviets, who knew something because they were men of action that had developed contacts, that were men of initiative. Those men were the first to be destroyed. Disappear into the mass, the inmate was told repeatedly by the guards. Don't dare to be noticeable. Don't dare to come to my attention. The inmates had to obey, e.g. to fight for the least conspicuous spots in roll call formations. If a man was noticeable, he might be noticed and not survived it. On pain of instant beating or death, the victim had to shrink out of the Nazis' sight and hearing. He had to try to erase any external signs of individuality and turn himself into the anonymous cell his captors held him to be. In effect, he had to absorb the guard's perspective and become, so far as possible, a self-made cipher. That a specific intention and not merely random cruelty was behind the above is indicated by the policy of the SS toward those prisoners who agreed to serve as their spies. A spy was always vulnerable to reprisals from other prisoners, but the SS would protect a spy only for a limited time, even if he was transmitting desired information. After this time, they would kill him or allow him to be killed. Under no circumstances, explains Bettelheim, would they let a prisoner become a person through his own efforts, even if those efforts were useful to the SS. The prisoner could not become a person, above all in his own eyes. He had to lose any connection to the realm of human efficacy or human worth. He had to learn to see himself as a cringing, foul-smelling sub-animal, a thing capable of nothing but momentary escape from terror and momentary satisfaction of the lowest physical needs. It was not enough for the prisoners to bury and forget their individuality. As some of the prisoners grasped at the time, it was intended that they become in their own eyes objects of loathing. At the outset, writes one survivor, the living places, the ditches, the mud, the piles of excrement behind the blocks had appalled me with their horrible filth. And then I saw the light. I saw that it was not a question of disorder or lack of organization, but that, on the contrary, a very thoroughly considered conscious idea was in the back of the camp's existence. They had condemned us to die in our own filth, to drown in mud, in our own excrement, They wished to abase us, to destroy our human dignity, to efface every vestige of humanity, to return us to the level of wild animals, to fill us with horror and contempt toward ourselves and our fellows. You cannot understand because this world cannot be understood.
הנה, וזה מתקשר למה שאתה אמרת על קצטניק.
כן.
זה מתקשר למה?
הקצטניק, הניצול שואה, שאמר שלא ניתן לנסות להבין את השואה.
כן. You cannot understand because this world cannot be understood. Such was the first part of the message broadcast to the prisoner by all the man-degrading, soul-destroying conditions he encountered, including the living standards incompatible with life, the rules without cause, the tortures without purpose, the conditions which no mind could take in or grasp, the conditions imposed because no mind could grasp them. And you cannot understand because you are nothing. Such was the second part of the message. To preserve a sense of self-value, some prisoners clung in the privacy of their own mind to the power of moral judgment, fiercely affirming the depravity of their torturers and the righteousness of their own cause, survival. In regard to acting on such judgment, these men did what they could. Washing, for instance, was considered by many inmates to be a matter of life and death importance. This was not for purposes of cleanliness and health, a survivor of Auschwitz explains. It was necessary as an instrument of moral survival because it expressed the power to refuse our consent. Washing was a means of defying the Nazi campaign of degradation. It was a daily reaffirmation of one's human status. It was a demonstration in action of that without which men could not survive psychologically. Self-assertion, self-protection, self-esteem. Many prisoners, however, though they may have tended themselves as routine, could not use the weapon of moral judgment. They had succumbed to the camp's war against what Miss Arendt calls the moral person, i.e. to the SS men's campaign against morality as such. One method of this campaign was to confront the prisoner with insolvable dilemmas posing unthinkable alternatives, and then demand that he make a choice. A man would have to choose, for instance, whether to betray and thus send to their death his friends or his wife and children. To make his position still more impossible, he would be warned that suicide would lead to his family's murder. Or a mother would be told to pick out which one of her children the Nazis should kill. It was not enough for the prisoner passively to endure evil. The intention was first to paralyze his moral faculty, then to force him, whatever his choice, to implicate himself in evil. The prisoner becomes, in Miss Arendt's words, a creature who chooses no longer between good and evil, but between murder and murder. And he seems to himself to become, however unwillingly, an accessory to the killers. In reason, no man can be held responsible for actions or decisions which have been forced upon him. In many cases, nevertheless, the camp policy did achieve its goal. In the minds of dazed, starving men, it was able to blur the line between victim and killer. The result was to erode the concept of moral responsibility as such, and or to shift the guilt to the victim.
זה מטורף. זה שהם הצליחו בצורה, בהתעללות הזו, בסוף גם לגרום לקורבנות לחוש אשמה, בנוסף על הכל, כי הם נמצאו אותם בעצם לקחת חלק בהשמדה.
To institutionalize this kind of result, and also to reduce the camp's need for Nazi manpower, the SS regularly offered to prisoners positions of substantial power in the camp administration. Since the men picked for these jobs effectively controlled most daily operations, they gained a much more secure and tolerable life. These men were in effect allowed to become a person. The price was the kind of person they had to become, the kind who demonstrated his loyalty by outdoing the Nazis in harshness. Some prisoners were tempted by such a prospect. Some gave in, choosing to become torturers rather than objects of torture. Many, writhing under the whip of a brutal capo, prisoner foreman, felt that they did not know any longer who to hate. Besides special dilemmas and temptations provided by the SS, there were the choices inherent in camp life itself, the virtue-mocking, conscience-dulling choices which no one could escape. When a man sees that his survival, or that of his wife or child, depends on a neighbor's piece of bread, and that the neighbor's survival depends on it too, the choice is stealing from a starving man or starving. When a council of prisoners meets to discuss an uncontrollably rebellious inmate, whose actions might provoke fatal reprisal against the whole group, the choice is murder of a helpless sufferer or being murdered. Even under such conditions, there were men who decided as conscientiously as they could on what moral principles they would act and how far they would permit themselves to go. But there were many more who gave in to futility. Those who surrendered came to feel that everyone, themselves included, is irredeemably wrong, or that right and wrong are terms without meaning. The base of human knowledge is the evidence provided by the senses, which are men's primary means of contact with reality. The camps did not restrict their concern to the higher reaches of cognition and evaluation. They went all the way down to the root. The concomitant of the conditions declaring, "Who are you to understand and who are you to judge?" was the brazen campaign declaring, "Who are you to perceive?" Don't dare to notice, the prisoners were ordered. Don't look at what is going on around you. Avert your eyes and ears. Don't be conscious. To violate this rule, Bettelheim states, was dangerous. For example, if an SS man was killing off a prisoner and other prisoners dared to look at what was going on in front of their eyes, he would instantly go after them too.
בעצם הם רוצים, מטפחים איזושהי אפתיות כלפי המציאות.
To avoid such reprisals, the prisoner had to learn to suppress any outward sign of perceptiveness, as he had to suppress any signs of individuality. Or else he had really to comply with the rule, to train himself in the art and practice of non-perception. Sometimes, if he could not help knowing a forbidden fact, this passive compliance, not to see or not to know, was not enough. In order to survive, one had to actively pretend not to observe, not to know what the SS required one not to know. Some prisoners concluded that the safest course was to become mentally inert, to deliberately suspend their own consciousness and allow their power of observation to atrophy. The greater a prisoner's intelligence, they felt, the more he grasped or knew, the greater was the threat to his survival. To these men, the inversion was complete. In the outside world, perception was a necessity of life. In the camps, the two were antonyms. But non-perception did not work either. To the extent that prisoners succeeded in stifling their power of awareness, they were helpless to protect themselves even from avoidable danger, and they did not last long. Not infrequently, a guard who had forbidden a prisoner to notice a certain action would, a few minutes later, call the same prisoner's attention to the action and even stress it. This was no contradiction, Bettelheim explains. It was simply an impressive lesson that said, "You may notice only what we wish you to notice. but you invite death if you notice things on your own volition.
שוב, זה לבטל את האינדיבידואליות ממש ברמה, שוב, מתחת לחייו. אוקיי? אנחנו גם, הנאצים גם החליטו בשביל היהודי או בשביל האסיר, מה הוא יתפוס בחושים שלו. זה רמה יותר עמוקה מלהוריד אדם ממש מתחת לרמה של החיים. הם שולטים בו אפילו באלמנטים הבסיסיים ביותר של יצורך, עם תודעה.
יש את הסיפור, האמת זה נכון, הלייכמן שתפסו אותו, הישראלים, אז הוא ביקש בדרך לארץ ללכת לשירותים, אחד החיילים הלך איתו, ואז הוא ביקש רשות להתחיל להשתין, כשהיה בשירותים, אז זה משמעת נאצית.
אני חושב שזה...
ככה נוהגים באסירים מבחינתו.
כן.
אני חושב שזה משהו, מה שאתה מתאר על רייכמן, מסוג של המנטליות הפרוסית של להיות חייל, היה קטע כזה של פשוט כאילו, תעקוב אחרי הוראות, מה שיגידו לך. היה קונמן מפורסם בפרוסיה, בתקופה של גרמניה הפרוסית, שפשוט הלך ומתפנים שהוא מישהו מהצבא, והיה מסתובב ואומר לחיילים לעשות, ואנשים היו מקשיבים לו, הוא היה מצליח ככה.
אני חושב שזה ממש יותר קשור לזה של
בגרמניה הנאצית או לפני?
לא, לפני, בפרוסיה. אבל אני חושב שהעניין פה הוא, שמתקשר לומר זה באמת כאילו כמה, על הצורה שבה הורגים את הבן אדם פסיכולוגית.
עוד משהו פה, זה מזכיר לי, הקטע הזה, הם לא אומרים לאסירים רק תאמצו את האידיאולוגיה הנאצית, הם אומרים להם אל תחשבו בכלל, פשוט תהיו שפוטים, כאילו תדקלמו, לא בהכרח, אל תחשבו על זה יותר מדי, פשוט תקבלו את הנאציזם. זה מזכיר לי ב-1984, שהייתה חבר של הדמות הראשית, ויצא, שהוא תמך באידיאולוגיה, אבל הוא היה אינטלקטואל כזה, הוא כל פעם חשב עליה וניתח אותה, לא ביקר אותה, אבל עצם זה שהוא חושב עליה יותר מדי, אז בשביל וינסנט ברור שהוא יענה בסופו של דבר, ואתה כדי לשרוד במספר הזה אתה צריך להיות זומביס, רק מדקלם.
זה מה שכן, מוזרים חרדים.
לא, מוזרים חרדים יש להם ישיבות,
הם מאבדים לאינדיבידואליות. ביהדות בכלל, אתה לא יכול גדולה, אם אתה אדם כאינדיבידואל תהיה גאון, המשמעות זה שאתה תהיה רק טוב כמו קודמים לפניך. זה נגיד הכי גבוה שאתה יכול להגיע בכלל. ורק יש לך דברים למלא, זה לא אותו דבר.
לא, יש מלא ויכוחים ועדות ומלא פרשנויות והיהודים, 200 דעות, איך אומרים?
כן, אבל אתה מחסר דברים, אתה לא, אתה רק מתעסק בתורה, אתה רק תקוף זה, גם אין לך באמת משהו שהוא שלך, זה רק אם הצלחת לעשות משהו, הצלחת באיזו מטריפולציה להיות יותר טוב ממישהו אחר, אבל זה לא כאילו שיש לך יצירתיות.
טוב, בואו נמשיך.
The prisoner was expected to give up everything. He was to give up every voluntary trait and function, from thought and values down to the movement of his eyes and the tilt of his head. But, remarks Bettelheim, if one gives up observing, reacting, and taking action, one gives up living one's own life. And this is exactly what the SS wanted to happen. Most of the guards did not know it, but the same type of cause was producing the same type of effect in them also. The young SS man may have imagined that he was merely doing a job or earning a promotion, but in fact, he was no longer living his own life either. The guards were well-clothed, well-fed, and ideologically trained, but they too were being processed and shaped. The prisoner was learning to submit to absolute power. The guard or administrator was learning to wield it with everything this requires and destroys in the wielder.
זה מזכיר לי צו הטבעות.
מה מזכיר?
אז זה כאילו הטבעת של הכוח שהורסת את הבן אדם.
שחיטה אותו, ואתה שומע...
זה כוח מסחית, זה לא...
לא, קודם כל אנחנו מדברים על כוח פוליטי.
יש משפט של היסטוריון, אני לא זוכר השם שלו, זה כוח לא משחית, הוא מגלה, הוא חושף, מה הבן אדם יעשה בכוח הזה.
המשפט המוכר זה לא רקטון, זה כוח מסחית, זה כוח אבסולוטי, מסחית בצורה אבסולוטית, לא נראה לי משפט נכון.
פה המקום הוא שבעצם אנשי האס-אס שהיו המדכאים, הכוח הזה השפיע עליהם לרעה בתור אלה שהם מיישמים, לא בתור אלה שהם אסירים, אלא בתור אלה שהם שולטים באסירים.
לא, הם כנראה היו רקובים מבחינה מוסרית, גם לפני כן קיבלו את הכוח.
בסופו של דבר אתה לא יכול בצורה סיסטמטית כל כך כלפי האסירים להתנהג בצורה מסוימת, ובחיים שלך לא להתנהג כך. בסופו של דבר גם האמינו שאין אינדיבידואליות ואין דם ואין...
אוקיי, בוא נמשיך.
With every causeless punishment he inflicted, whether in response to an order or on his own initiative, the young guard was negating the idea of man as a sovereign, rights-possessing entity. He was negating it not only in the prisoner's mind, but in his own. With every unthinkable atrocity he committed, the guard was negating his former sense of morality. He was helping to make unreal, in his own eyes, his pre-camp life, including such non-Nazi values as he had once pursued. With every insane rule and switching contradiction he enforced or invented, the guard was schooling himself in senselessness. He was learning to make the negation of logic into a mental habit, which soon became second nature to him. The guard experienced all these negations from the receiving end also. There was no form of punishment or evil or wanton caprice that his superiors did not inflict on him whenever they chose. The guard's defiance of all sense created in them a profound feeling of instability and helplessness, and as a result, a profound feeling of dependence on their superiors. Thus, obedience in the camps became a self-reinforcing trait. It was gradually stripping the SS of their capacity to judge or to protest. Obedience was turning the young Nazis into monsters of obedience. According to Bettelheim, the higher a man stood in the hierarchy, the more fully he embodied this state. Bettelheim gives the example of Hess, the commandant of Auschwitz, who so laid aside his personal existence that he ended a mere executor of official demands. While his physical death came later, he became a living corpse from the time he assumed command of Auschwitz. He had to divest himself so entirely of self-respect and self-love, of feeling and personality, that for all practical purposes, he was little more than a machine functioning only as his superiors flicked the buttons of command. The power lusters of the death factories did not pursue their quest with impunity. The opponents of man's rights, trampling on the rights of others, were underscoring their own rightslessness. The crusaders against the individual, crushing the self-respect and self-love of their enemies, were losing their own in the process. The authors and rulers of a brain-wrecking dimension, learning to accept and adapt to it, were making themselves brainless. No one, neither prisoners nor guards, could stand it or even fully believe it. The prisoners could not believe a world in which the whim of the SS set all the terms of human existence, replacing reality as the basic absolute and frame of reference. They could not believe a world which seemed, in Miss Arendt's words, to give permanence to the process of dying itself, as if some evil spirit gone mad were amusing himself by stopping them for a while between life and death. They had to struggle even to take in the kind of events they witnessed or heard about, such as major surgery being performed on prisoners by trained doctors, without the slightest reason, a survivor writes, and without anesthesia. Or, as another reports, an inmate being thrown for punishment into a large kettle of boiling water intended for preparing coffee for the camp. The victim was scalded to death, but the coffee was prepared from the water all the same. The youngsters being picked out at random, seized by their feet and dashed against tree trunks. Or flames leaping up from a ditch, gigantic flames. The Nazis were burning something. A lorry drew up at the pit and delivered its load. Little children. Babies. Yes, I saw it with my own eyes. Was I awake? I could not believe it. It seemed to me I'm in another world. It was so unbelievable that many of the prisoners had hallucinations. A survivor of Auschwitz. I lived as in a dream, waiting for someone to awaken me. This can't be true. Such things just don't happen. Prisoners of Buchenwald, according to Bettelheim. Aside from the actual murders, this was the most lethal feature of the camps, that most prisoners could not accept the reality of what they saw. They could not reconcile their horror with life as they had once known it, and yet they could not deny the evidence of their senses. To such men, the camps lost all connection to life on earth and acquired a kind of metaphysical aura, the aura of being not human institutions in Europe, but another world, an impossible world, like a second supernatural dimension of existence, inconceivable in itself, yet wiping out the first. The concentration camp seemed to its inmates to be a dimension, which is at the same time a foolish nightmare and true reality. A dimension which cannot be, yet cannot be escaped. A dimension which is not, but which also terrifyingly is. It was a world of A and not A.
אוקיי, אנחנו נעצור כאן. השעה 9. תודה רבה לכולם, ואנחנו נתראה כנראה שבוע.
איך הולך בשורה הספר?
Yeah, the audio in the room you guys are in is the audio, the mic in the room that you're in. In general, it's like sometimes